Here we go again.
Resident Evil.
Beginning before the events of Resident Evil 2, we open on Jill Valentine's apartment as seen through her eyes, and take a moment to remember that the RE engine was once originally designed for a first-person game, and marvel at just how close we can get to these textures with them still looking incredible. However, even from the get-go, we can get an inkling that something is wrong. The post-processing filter and lighting places us in somewhere more like Silent Hill than Raccoon City, and you wouldn't be hard-pushed to guess that maybe Jill isn't awake. That being said, Jill's apartment is a masterclass in environmental storytelling. It's now a cluttered mess that looks like it was once a clean and organized space. All around we can see signs of neglect that hint at the owner having a somewhat drastic shift in their priorities. This is further highlighted by the huge conspiracy theory style board now covering one wall, and articles and correspondence referring to the Umbrella Pharmaceutical Company, a company we are all by now only too well acquainted with. This surreal experience ends with us discovering that while Jill did in fact survive the Spencer Mansion incident alive and well, she certainly wasn't unscarred. And our eyes open again on the same room, only this time rendered minus the post-processing filter. We get to explore Jill's apartment for a second time as we gear up for the second coolest entrance of the game.
Let me grab mine.
That's right, the game called Nemesis is not messing around with its titular antagonist. And while this pre-tutorial sequence of events is clearly pre-scripted, with no real danger towards the player, it certainly sets an incredible pace for the game, and demonstrates just what an absolute badass Jill really is. Remember that while we've explored the ruin of the post-apocalyptic Raccoon City with Claire and Leon, and maybe even Hunk, this is only the second time Jill has seen a bioorganic weapon, BOW, in all its monstrous glory. The chase leads Jill into the heart of the now overrun city, and based on her reaction we can guess that while she has been keeping herself somewhat cut off from the world, this outbreak seems to have happened almost overnight. Aiding her in this initial stage is Brad, who goes some way to having a kind of redemption arc in this game.
Don't fuck up like I do. Go!
She escapes the horde, eventually making it to the roof of a parking lot, where she once again finds herself face to face with her new stalker. Staring down such a terrifying foe, she takes the only logical course of action and drives a car with herself and the monster attached to it off the roof and smashing into the ground below with no airbag. Somehow still alive and not crippled, our hero crawls away from the wreck before it goes up in flames. And from the fire, the beast rises again, with the only damage received seemingly to its clothes, unmasking the creature and revealing a face only a mother could truly love. This tense moment climaxes with the game's coolest entrance, and the arrival of Carlos.
Hey! Fuckface!
Actually, can we just watch that again?
Hey! Fuckface!
So not only does Carlos establish his credentials as a first-class badass, but we also get a hint of just how powerful this creature is. The rocket launcher has in general been the go-to weapon for finishing off the game's most powerful enemies, and here we see Nemesis is capable of both deflecting and even tanking hits from one. And with that, this very charming young man escorts Jill to the subway, where we find out he is part of Umbrella's private mercenary army, here with others, to help evacuate as many people as possible from the city via the subway, and that they've stumbled onto a few problems that could really use the personal attention of one of Raccoon City's own super cops. If you're feeling like this is a lot of preamble just to get into the game, well, you'd be right. Especially compared to how the original kicks things off. That's it. Just go. But while other games that don't consider how lengthy introductions can impact their replayability, this very cinematic and high adrenaline opening remains fun even after a few playthroughs. And so we finally emerge into the infested streets of the city and get to dig into the meat of the game. It's no secret that RE3 Remake plays much looser with its source material than the remake of 2, something I overall have absolutely no problem with, at least in regards to gameplay. Look, if you're a hardcore fan of the PS1 Nemesis game and you just wanted to see exactly that but with better graphics, well, I do sympathize with you at least. I would have much preferred to see the full A and B scenarios return to RE2 over what we did get, but if you've watched my review of that, you no doubt know exactly what I think of that game overall. In general, however, I don't think just updating the game's graphics is a worthwhile venture when bringing a beloved game from such a long time ago to modern hardware and a modern audience. Game design is an iterative or trial and error process, so if you're going to tread the same ground again, then change is always inevitable. Consider the use of a subway train as a means of evacuating the citizens over an overland tram. Yes, that's the real word for a streetcar. While the latter is certainly quaint and loaded with the somewhat old-timey personality that could be found in most of the original games, it just doesn't make a lot of sense really. My experience with trams is that they are overall quite slow, and wouldn't have much in the way of defense against a monstrous swarm. However, you can see how the UBCS have managed to create a kind of fortress and beacon out of the subway station, and the subway cars no doubt will carry more people much faster out of the city. On top of that, it just looks more realistic, and this game is far more realistic looking than the original. That's a big part of why change happens. Things get tested and experimented with, and what might look good in a comic may not have the same impact on a cinema screen. The same can be said for moving through console generations. This probably is also a big reason why many puzzles in the remake of 2 were streamlined or changed into something more realistic than stylistic. Players of the RE2 remake, no doubt the main target audience for this installment, will find this whole setup very familiar indeed. The control scheme here is almost identical to that of the remake of 2, but now with the addition of an evade button, which has basically replaced the defensive weapons. And right off the bat, we have a lot to talk about with this. Along with some series staples, such as the Samurai Edge handgun and mixing powders to create ammunition, the dodge mechanic was introduced in the PS1 original, and look, I'm not gonna say that it's broken, because I've seen videos of no damage runs of this game where it's used flawlessly, but it's certainly a very unintuitive and poorly explained mechanic in the PS1 game. There also isn't any kind of tutorial level to let you get to grips with it, as the game just drops you into the flaming ruins of Raccoon City with a couple of documents to briefly explain how things might work. Though, I'd call these the loosest possible interpretation of the word instructions. Now, RE regulars will get on pretty well without these mechanics for quite some time, even with the immensely upped enemy count in this game, but you'll eventually be furiously screaming at your screen as Nemesis lands numerous cheap shots on you, floors you with his Undertaker chokeslam, and then gets a free hit on you, effectively repeating the same attack before you can open your inventory and heal, because nowhere in the game's instructions does it talk about how to get up off the floor when you've been knocked down. I mean, this is bad, guys. Really bad. Certainly some of these issues can be put down to this being an early 3D title, and as I said before, this was the age when we were really figuring out what a 3D action game was supposed to be. But I can only imagine how frustrating it must have been back in the late 90s without the aid of YouTube Let's Plays trying to figure out this mechanic when the closest you get to a hint is hit all the buttons. In the remake, the dodge mechanic is now firmly bound to a shoulder button and plays an animation on every press, which will get you out of a lot of tight situations, with a well-timed press opening up the opportunity for a counter-attack. The loss of the defensive weapons is also something of a blow, especially when you're playing these games back to back and trying to speedrun the fourth survivor in your spare time. Though, I understand why one layer of defense was taken away, as having two could have made the game a little too easy. the knife has now returned to the slot of a main weapon, and no longer degrades with use, which is apparently in response to feedback from the second game, so props to the developers for listening to their audience. Once the adaptation phase is over though, regular players will find themselves moving, fighting, and unlocking doors in this pandemic apocalypse like they never left. And so I guess we need to set the record straight here and say that Resident Evil 4 was not the first action-heavy title in the series. This one was. Hell, even Code Veronica has characters diving around, dual-wielding pistols and machine guns like they're in a John Woo movie. The series was always heading this way anyway, if for no other reason than zombies just don't stay scary for very long. Even these new high-res monstrosities lack the impact they had from the first time we saw them in Resident Evil 2. This game exchanges the tight dark corridors of the police station for much more open and well-lit environments, and the enemies now move in swarms. That's not to say that there aren't ammunition and health item limitations, though the original is very liberal with its green herbs, or that the game is lacking in atmosphere. The hospital, for example, is a real return to the tight close-quarter feels of the second game, and there are a few jump scares and surprises here and there, chief amongst them being the return of the hunters from the first game, who look spectacular and hit like a ton of bricks. Now, however, we've got more enemies and red explosive barrels scattered around the place because game. I mean, I'm not complaining. It's actually really fun. Pacing is a very important part of level design. Action games need very powerful forward momentum, which is a concept distilled to its absolute purity in the incredible Doom Eternal. Resident Evil 2 has momentum, but you're often using it to run away from enemies. RE2 is a slow burning game, where you creep through the levels, listening for the hiss and click-clack of licker claws, or cautiously approach slumping corpses, weapon trained on them, waiting for the first sign of movement, while straining your ears for the thunk, thunk, thunk of Mr. X's boots somewhere in the station. But RE2 is about a rookie cop and a girl who's probably never fired a gun outside of a range. This game is about Jill Goddamn Valentine from the RCPD STARS, one of the last survivors of the Arkley Mansion nightmare, and she's not running from anyone. Well, okay, maybe one guy. The point is, Jill is a powerhouse of forward momentum, and everything about her, from her look to the way she carries herself and interacts with all the other soldier boys, screams action hero. So, it's pretty safe to say this is an action game. That being said, it's a testament to the storytelling that Jill can be reduced to a nearly crippled mess in seconds by the arrival of Nemesis, when she steamrolls the legions of the dead like it's just what she does on a Tuesday. So our story is already well set up from the second game. In fact, this particular story doesn't have a lot to do with the meta-narrative at all. All of the setup was explained away in the second game, and we are basically just trying to escape this nightmare. Pretty standard Resident Evil stuff, really. However, just to make matters worse, Umbrella are looking to cover their tracks, to hide their involvement with the creation and ultimately the release of this deadly plague. And to this end, they have dispatched an experimental superweapon to take out the STARS members who witnessed everything at the mansion. Specifically, the last two in the city, Brad and Jill. Jill's major goal is just to get out alive, but being the people-oriented law enforcement officer that she is, she opts to get involved with the rescue attempts being carried out by the UBCS. This leads Jill to have to perform various objectives around a city filled with zombies, hunters, and more disgusting things. Japan, why you gotta be like that? While also being relentlessly pursued by the game's super boss and having to fight through all kinds of hell just to stay alive. It's as good a setup as any other RE game. There's plenty of good things to say about its execution, as well as quite a few bad. So what is a Nemesis?
How many times have we fought?
Hard to say. It's the only memory I have of us since we were kids.
No. Well, I mean, yes, but in regards to a Resident Evil game. You see, most games have boss fights, and some games have recurring boss fights with a character or creature who grows in power or learns from the previous encounter. And Nemesis goes a step further though, by stalking the player throughout the game and being a menace in the regular levels as well. It's a creature that's designed to keep you on edge and make you feel vulnerable by breaking certain rules of a gameplay loop. Specifically, a Nemesis cannot be defeated in a conventional way until the game says it's okay for you to do so. It can be stunned and rendered immobile for some amount of time so that you can escape before it comes after you again. The system was introduced in the original RE2 with Mr. X, but these scenes only took place in very specific areas, and he was slow and could quickly be evaded by just running through a door. Nemesis was seemingly free, though if you go back and play the PS1 game now, you'll know that's not really the case. He still only appears at very specific points like Mr. X, but he can chase you through doors. He was actually the first enemy in the series to be able to, and moves much faster than Jill. The remake has been criticized for making Nemesis feel too scripted. This is simply because there are only two major sections where he pursues you at length. The first is the pre-tutorial opening, and the second is the latter half of the downtown area, up until you escape on the subway. All his other appearances are either cutscenes or boss fights. So, they're not wrong that he's less of a persistent threat, but he certainly wasn't the free agent in the original game that people claim he was either. And since we're dealing with a major boss creature here, we should probably talk about what makes a good boss and ask if Nemesis is one. To put it simply, a boss is a test. It's something that challenges your ability with the game's mechanics by being overall more dangerous and harder to overcome than regular enemies, usually with a good deal of spectacle thrown in for good measure. A great final boss is the ultimate test, forcing you to bring every skill and weapon you've gathered to bear on them, and demand you flow effortlessly through the game's dance or face the most savage consequences. The fight against Nemesis atop the towering inferno is absolutely epic. It's the first time we've seen him using weapons in this game, and the escape to the building roof really sets the tone. We know it's coming. We've been waiting for it. He's already been a problem, and it's time for some payback. This is a great fight, testing us on our movement, shooting and dodging. Precision can be rewarded with a fast victory, and there are environmental elements we can use to help us too. So, score 1 point there. Then, at the clock tower, our persistent stalker is now showing signs of damage and has begun to adapt, becoming more feral and aggressive overall. While he's minus a projectile weapon, he's much faster now, and we'd better be dodging with breakneck speed and not reloading at the wrong moment. This section also introduced the sticky mines, and while we didn't really get to practice with these prior to the encounter, it's pretty easy to figure out how they go. Overall, this was another satisfying fight that really got my heart pumping the first time it happened, and... Hello? Wow, that looks familiar. What's that? A parasite? Maybe I'll ask Leon about it later. The two final encounters bother me a little. They're not bad, but there's a couple of boss fight crimes in there. The acid pit fight starts off really good. The setup and the setting are a great way to kick off the penultimate showdown. The fight is similar to the clock tower battle, only now Nemesis and Jill have more powerful weapons, meaning precise dodging and countering is really important. Instead of shooting mines onto the walls, you can now hit targets on the various generators that Nemesis runs on to cause explosions, which renders him vulnerable to attack for a few moments. And then they pull a cheap shot by having zombies spawn into the arena to distract you from him. A move like this always seems like a quick fix for playtesters saying a boss is too easy. I think a final standoff should be one-on-one, at least with this kind of game, with this kind of enemy. It's not exactly deal-breaking, but it crosses the boundary from challenging into frustrating. The final fight, something I refer to as the epilogue boss, is the kind of boss that sells itself on spectacle over challenge. Now, don't get me wrong, the spectacle hits hard, and man, I love the way Jill interacts with this thing. But there isn't much in the way of a challenge here. Just pop the various obvious weak points, dodge the very obvious attacks, and fire the super weapon. I mean, it's fun. Like, a lot of fun. and a very satisfying ending. But it's not exactly a challenging final fight. So let's talk about our characters. Our main protagonist is Jill Valentine, now fully reimagined in the beautiful RE engine. And if there isn't a woman like this somewhere out there in the world, well, then I guess I'm gonna become like one of those Japanese guys who marries his Hatsune Miku doll. Because, wow, this woman. Jill was pretty tough even in the first game. Despite her run being easier than Chris's, I feel she establishes herself as a competent and capable warrior, and it's more than believable that within the confines of the game world's logic, she was capable of surviving the nightmare and taking on the tyrant. Now with the full RE engine upgrade, and the first-rate voice and character acting this game has, I am completely sold on Jill as a top-tier badass. Her interactions with other characters, and the way she handles her constant encounters with Nemesis really sell her as someone with training, experience, and an iron will. And I'd like to take this moment to make a small segue into talking about Brad. I mentioned before that this guy has something of a rep for being a coward, something originally established in the first game and doubled down on somewhat in the original Nemesis game. However, his interactions with Jill in this game speak volumes about their lived experiences together, and the fact that he literally sacrifices himself for her really redeems him in the end. And remember when Marvin said this?
And don't make my mistake. If you see one of those things, uniform or not, you do not hesitate. You take it out, or you run.
Well, now we know where that came from.
Sorry.
Poor guy. But it's difficult to talk about Jill's characterization without talking about her co-stars and supporting cast. And whatever else you can say about this game, the writing, character design, and voice acting is second to none. There isn't a single character who isn't in some way memorable, whether it's the despicable Nikolai or the original game's throwaway characters like Mikhail and Tyrell. Each one has now been upgraded to have their own personality quirks and memorable moments in this game. First and foremost among these is Carlos. He's a member of Umbrella's mercenary army, something every pharmaceutical company needs, and this game's second playable protagonist. And man, this guy is cool. Actually, can we just watch that entrance one more time?
Hey! Fuckface!
Carlos is clearly quite young, and while I wouldn't say he's naive, he's certainly not all that well clued up on who's signing his paychecks and what their agenda really is. He lacks the grizzled look of Mikhail or the cynical cold stare of Nikolai, and considering that his job is to fight reanimated corpses, I can't tell if he spent too much or not enough time taking care of his hair. But everything about him is very charming, which is a big upgrade from his original incarnation. While the writing and voice acting was getting better by the third game, it was still a long way from cinematic, and all seemed very forced. Despite working for the people Jill perceives to be the enemy, he quickly wins her trust, and eventually, her friendship. Well, not right away, but eventually. His confident strut and snappy one-liners make him very likable, which is something that many writers have really got wrong in the past. He himself quickly becomes attached to Jill. Maybe he admires the way she so willingly puts herself in harm's way for others, or maybe he just has a working pair of eyes. But he soon finds himself being the target of banter from his teammates about her, and Tyrell isn't at all surprised when he runs off to help her. Now we need to talk about Nikolai. And this guy is easily one of the most well-written antagonists in the series. Sure, we've had Wesker, who is a long-running, somewhat cartoonish supervillain, but he has ambitions and motivations that could be considered admirable in some ways. Nikolai is just cold, calculating, and brutally merciless. He's here to get paid and get out. He does things that get under Jill's skin, and in turn our own, and annoyingly, keeps getting the upper hand on her when we just want a chance to punch him in the face. Sounds kind of familiar, actually. Overall, Nikolai is a far greater villain than Nemesis. We'll get to this a little more in the review of RE7, but villains with a human face and voice are by far more hateful and even scarier than giant monstrosities. Nemesis is grotesque, intimidating, and powerful, sure. But once the spectacle of it has lost its edge, well, I've killed 1,000 of these things before. Nemesis likewise didn't get a choice to be the way it is. Nor is it motivated by greed, hate, or some other relatable emotion. It was created, programmed, and then released. But a human, a person, with a background, who went to school like we did, who drinks, eats, and defecates like we do. A person with a story, who had many choices and chances to be better that led him to this point, and seemingly, actively, chose to just be a horrible person. Now that's a real villain. Villains like that resonate with those deep down dark places in our own souls, and call to the parts of our own being that we pretend don't exist. In those depths, somewhere we know there's a part of us just like him, that's perfectly selfish and greedy, and would do almost anything to get one up on someone. And wouldn't it be oh so exciting to just let that thing out and see what happens? How liberating it would be to shed all of society's taboos and embrace our darkest desires. Therein lies true fear. Not the faceless grotesque monstrosity, but the demon that wears our own face. Pitted against this merciless man and the unstoppable creature stalking her, Jill really shines as one of the series' standout heroes. She stumbles, she falls, but she keeps getting back up, and keeps pushing forward, keeps fighting for hope, for a chance that the people of Raccoon City might yet be saved. This is, without a doubt, the game's strongest point. This may actually be one of the best stories told in the series, which is why it's such a shame the game has quite a few shortcomings. And short is the main word here. As with the previous games, RE3 has a variety of locations, from the streets of Raccoon City to the ultra sci-fi Nest 2 lab, and even a brief return to the police station. As before, the levels are designed in such a way that backtracking is a necessary part of exploration. Most of the locations from the original are there, though they've received a substantial redesign in many ways. It is, however, nice to see puzzles from the original resurface in the remake at different locations and opening into different areas. Unlike the previous games, however, there is a much stronger sense of linear progression through this game, and several points that effectively cut the player off from previous locations, which leads me to having to deal with one of the biggest criticisms that this game has received. It's short. Now, RE2 clocks in around 5 hours for a casual playthrough, which could be considered short by today's standards, where people expect anything from 10 hours to upwards of 100 hours of play, depending on the genre. However, RE2 is very tight. The game has almost no fat on it at all. There are no optional side missions that deviate from the main story, or grinding, a word that should not be part of any gameplay loop. Games are not for work, they are for play. The game doesn't overstay its welcome with any kind of padding. All of the locations and puzzles and the routes you take around the police station flow smoothly from start to finish. Except for Mr. X, but we've already talked about him. The base game time is almost quadrupled by the fact that there are effectively 4 scenarios to play in order to get the full grasp of the story, and the 4th survivor mode as well. RE3, however, is short. Both the individual environments are smaller than those in RE2, and their lack of connectivity creates a much more linear gameplay with an almost level-like structure. And once a level is finished, you don't get to return to it, meaning environments can't be reused to extend the gameplay time. The downtown area of RE3 gets quite a lot of mileage overall, with Jill doing several laps of the place to unlock doors, remove barriers, and escape her ever-pursuing Nemesis. Even after the sewers, which may as well just be called the grenade launcher training level, we're back in those same streets, running from Nemesis and being chased to the top of the burning building to have a climactic standoff with him, before Bruce Willising ourselves back to the surface and being chased back to the subway by the beast now armed with a rocket launcher. It's a pretty tight and well made level all in all, and I like the way Nemesis keeps changing his hunting tactics rather than just using the Mr. X strategy of walk slowly towards you and punch you. But once we're on the train and out of there, we're pretty much in linear level land. Add to that the fact that the whole story for both playable characters is covered in a single playthrough, and there's no extra survivor or mercenaries mode. You'd be forgiven for thinking this game, that launched with the same price tag as its predecessor, was a little lacking in content. That is, of course, unless you're into playing Resistance online, and since nobody is, honestly we all just want an update to Outbreak, I don't think the multiplayer mode makes up for the lack of single player. Still, despite everything I just said, all the locations we do see have once again been crafted with all the love and attention of those we visit in the previous games. The streets of the city have a real war zone vibe to them, with crashed cars, blazing infernos, zombies clawing at you from everywhere, and even a few charming puzzle boxes for you to open. We spend quite a lot of time here, and it's a welcome change of pace from cramped corridors and gothic architecture. When we do make a brief return to the police station as Carlos, I get the feeling of arriving at a theatre or movie set a few hours too early. Important objects in the second game are conveniently covered with cloths, or doors are barricaded off to limit the amount of places we can visit. You are also responsible for creating the problem in the showers that either Leon or Claire has to fix when they finally do get there. When we start exploring the hospital, we get the same claustrophobic feeling and sense of environmental storytelling that we got playing the second game. And while the Nest 2 lab is much smaller than the Nest lab, destroyed by Leon, Claire and Birkin, it still has a couple of awe-inspiring moments worked into it. Now, fans of the original game will notice that several locations are very much absent from this list. Notably, the Clock Tower area. This was a mid-game area in the original Nemesis game that took place in an old clock tower, complete with gothic architecture, antiquated furniture, and locks that used music boxes to open them. Sound familiar?
Where did they go?
It's a very charming callback to the Spencer estate from the first game, and something of a break from the intense battles in the streets. In the remake, the exterior of the tower is merely the setting for one boss battle with Nemesis. There were some rumours about it being brought back in as DLC in some way, but that would be kind of a dick move on Capcom's behalf if you ask me. And while I would love to see the clock tower reimagined in the RE engine, I'm still not sure adding another small disconnected section to the game would really solve its problems. I think it would be better overall to have expanded on the existing areas already in the game and keep the connectivity in them so that the player can travel all the way back to the beginning if needed. That way, the maximum amount of usage could have been squeezed out of each location. So I've definitely been more critical of this game than any other. But do the flaws outweigh the strengths? No, not at all. In the end, this is still a well-paced action game with a few horror elements. It has an awesome story and cast of characters and some very well-crafted levels. No, it's not the instant classic that RE2 was. I mean, I could say the same about the original Nemesis game actually, but it's a hell of a ride, if a little fast to the finish. Were I making this review at its launch, I might be a little harder pressed to recommend it to you, given that it originally retailed for the same price as RE2, and is a game with significantly less content. However, with the way the price can go in a Steam sale, I would definitely recommend picking it up at a discount. You'll get a good rainy weekend out of it, and hey, maybe if you and a few friends get together to play Resistance sometime, you might even feel you got your money's worth out of that. Even mediocre experiences can be fun with a bunch of friends in voice chat. And so, with the light of that explosion, the Raccoon City saga ends for the second time. Leon, Claire and Sherry walk off into the sunset, and Jill flies away with Carlos, and in one version of history at least, Barry Burton. As I'm sure most of us know, this isn't the end of the Umbrella Corporation, or the threat of bioorganic weapons in general. Our series' mainstay heroes have a lot of bloody work ahead of them, still, with zombies, tyrants, and all manner of terrifying creatures set to be unleashed upon the world. And while I am aware of what number comes after 3, and indeed, what game really comes after 3, this series' title is Lockdown Reviews. It's a series talking about the games I played when I was in quarantine with COVID-19 over December 2020. So, while the global stage awaits and all manner of cartoonish supervillains have yet to be explored in this series, it seems we will be visiting somewhere much smaller than all that. A house in Mississippi. An old place, owned by a reclusive family. We're going to meet a new protagonist who will wander off the beaten path and stumble into somewhere truly dark and terrifying. One more time, we must descend into blood, tears, and madness as we meet the Baker family. A family living far too close to a biohazard.
Ethan! Ethan! Ethan!